first I'm going to give you a very brief introduction. So in recent years, we've seen increased interest in these so-called native invaders. Native species that act like invasive species in some way, whether through range expansions, increases in population size, etc. But whether we're talking about something like bluegill sunfish or golden eagles, determining whether management intervention is actually necessary can be very difficult, and if so, just how much of that native species should actually be removed. When you add in multiple economic and ecological objectives, making those management decisions can become even more difficult. So you probably already guessed that we're not going to be talking about golden eagles or bluegill sunfish today. Instead, we're going to be focusing on western juniper, this long-lived native conifer species that's native to California and Oregon and parts of Nevada. So let's see here. You've already seen this map once before in David's talk. So just briefly here, in green, that's the juniper range, and it currently covers about 9 million acres. For our study, we focused on just a portion of this range, which I've highlighted in orange in the Modoc Plateau in Northern California. So here's another series of historical photos, just because we really love historical photos. So the top panel here is an area called Keystone Ranch in Oregon, and this photo was taken in about 1890. And then the bottom panel shows the same region photographed just over 100 years later. And you can see how densely juniper covers this landscape, almost to the fact that it might be a closed canopy at this point. So speaking more specifically about western juniper in Modoc County, there's currently about 2.2 million acres of western juniper, and it's primarily on Forest Service and Bureau of Land Management land on the plateau. And as Cece told us, western juniper does appear to threaten sage-grouse survival for a number of reasons. So as a result, much of the funding for juniper removal projects comes from these sage-grouse conservation projects, like the Natural Resource Conservation Service Sage-Grouse Initiative. So there's a pretty substantial chunk of change that's spent on juniper removal in California. So in the 2010 fiscal year, it's about $3.2 million. And in 2011, it was about $5.9 million. So although western juniper does appear to threaten a range of wildlife and plant species, we've chosen to focus on just two of those impacts for our study. The impact of western juniper on herbaceous forage for cattle, and on the survival and habitat conservation of the threatened greater sage-grouse species. So we've chosen these two impacts for several reasons, but the first and foremost is that these two impacts are kind of the key players in the system, both economically and ecologically. So cattle ranching provides much of the revenue in this region. And sage-grouse not only do conservation projects fund most of juniper removal projects, but it's also currently under consideration, as you've heard, under the Endangered Species Act for listing. Okay. So just as a reminder of kind of the summary of previous talks, juniper, these dense juniper woodlands like what you see here, are not conducive to sage-grouse survival, nor to the production of herbaceous forage for cattle. On the sage-grouse side of things, we think that's because they provide perching habitat for a lot of these predatory raptors. So sage-grouse, as Cece told us, will actually preferentially avoid these areas with dense juniper woodland, and David also mentioned that cattle don't really like them as well. And part of that is because once the canopy closes in, there's not very much herbaceous forage at all in these shady areas. All right, so let's talk a bit about the research questions that we addressed. So first and foremost, our overarching question was whether or not juniper management strategies, treatment strategies, change based on whether you're managing for sage-grouse habitat conservation or herbage production or some combination of the two. We also had a number of sub-questions related to that primary question. So first of all, we were interested in whether the spatial distribution of treatment, i.e. where you're treating for juniper and where you're not treating, whether that changes depending on what your management goals are, whether you're managing for forage or for cattle or for sage-grouse. And then secondly, we were interested in how compatible these two management goals are actually. So we've heard some of this kind of hinted hinted at this morning that there may be a synergy between managing juniper for forage, and managing it for sage-grouse conservation. So we were particularly interested in this idea of synergy between the two goals. And during our interviews with wildlife biologists and land managers, this was an idea that we came up against several times, that these two goals may not necessarily be mutually exclusive. So this quote, actions to benefit grouse also benefit sustainable ranching. Ranchers would have removed juniper, treated annual grasses, and tried to implement better grazing management systems anyway. And these just happen to be the same things that grouse need. So this was the kind of statement that we were interested in evaluating with our model. Now I'm going to turn it over to Gabe to talk about some of the strategies we used for addressing these questions.
Okay, so Shayla just got done framing our sort of specific research questions. I'll move forward by first framing our research strategy and then get into detailing the methods in which we sort of assess the benefits to juniper treatment. So in terms of research area, we focused on these 4 red patches in the Modoc Plateau region of northeastern California. Size-wise, this area is about 4,200 square miles, which is about the size of Modoc County. Now, Redding is about 150 miles to the southwest, and Davis and Sacramento are about 300 miles to the south here. Now, we focused on these patches because they provided the best sort of high detail, high resolution juniper canopy cover data. Moreover, these areas are endowed with a sage-grouse population, so they had everything we're looking for. So if you remember back to the research question that Shayla posed, we're interested in evaluating the ways in which benefits vary when we change the focal area from sage-grouse habitat and herbage production. So in terms of a research strategy, we could generally say we're interested in identifying areas to treat juniper removal, which maximize benefits both to herbage production and sage-grouse habitat, given a budget allowance with which we were to operate with. Now, if we were to boil that down to just one sentence, we might say we wanted to optimize treatment decisions for a large area using a spatially explicit analysis. So the spatially explicit part is going to manifest itself in the configuration of treatment sites in this sort of checkerboard pattern of our landscape here. All right, so I just did the research strategy. I'm going to move on to how we assess the benefits now. All right, so I think it's worth repeating that we're interested in finding treatment areas that maximize benefits to herbage production and sage-grouse. Now here we've categorized these under cell characteristics. So herbage production, sage-grouse benefits, and costs. And these in turn are determined by the cell attributes, which are juniper canopy cover, slope, soil moisture, and temperature. Now we partition our landscape into this checkerboard pattern because that provided a better detail for evaluating these cell attributes. For now, I'll leave it at that, but Derek will dig deeper into this in a few minutes.
Dave, can I just ask a quick question? So
Sure.
the soil characteristics, like adaptive things, are they fairly constant? I mean, I know you're talking about soil moisture, and sometimes that will incorporate that.
That's
but you're talking about soil characteristics.
Yeah, so it's soil moisture. That's just a constant for each of these little.
I'm just thinking about other aspects of the soil. Is that something that is fairly constant in this area? You know, how much, well, I guess variability in soil, adaptive, you know, like a lot of people, like I'm not a soil scientist, but if you have soil scientists, they'd be all over you, like, what about the soil? You know?
Yeah, so we have limited data in terms of biophysical data. Soil moisture is one of those variables that we had to put into this model.
There's got to be soil mass.
So this is actually soil water holding capacity,
Yeah.
and we got that from the
So that would be pretty good for texture, but I'm just thinking about things like fertility. Is it fairly constant in these areas or not? Because it seems like fertility might be important in terms of lots of things, the plants. Mostly. So I mean, I don't know. Does that make a difference? I have no idea. And maybe the soil is fairly.
No. Could
Who
we
knows
touch
anything
on-
about MODOC? I mean, what about the soils up there?
There's some soil depth differences and
Yeah,
rock content.
but do you think in terms of general soil fertility aspects?
You see a variety of, I guess if you're, how well it grows vegetation is kind of what you're getting at.
Yeah, right.
guess.
How much things like
There are
nitrogen,
several patches of highly alkaline soils in the area, so you get some diversity in its capacity to grow vegetation. And we see that sometimes when we're seeding projects. You have some projects that it doesn't matter how much you throw out there, it just isn't going to grow. So there is some patchiness in its ability, its capacity to actually grow vegetation. But those are natural patches, so.
Okay, so that's why I'm just, maybe it doesn't matter.
We could touch on this
I'm
later.
throwing it out. I'm throwing it out.
Yeah, I'm gonna move on. So in terms of our evaluating herbage production benefits, we adapted a model from the literature. In fact, no, this is not one touched on, but we adapted a regression model from the literature using data obtained from folks here at UC Davis. This is one of the studies David just touched on in his last presentation. In particular, we obtained data on 97 circular herbaceous data and biophysical data for 97 circular plots in MODOC and neighboring counties. And then we modeled herbage production as a function of juniper canopy cover, soil water retention, temperature variables, slope, and a few others that were sort of less important in the model output. So what did this relationship look like? Well, it looked like this. Here we've got the natural log of herbage production in kilograms per acre modeled as a function of the percentage juniper canopy cover on the site. We're holding all other variables constant at their means here in this figure here. The two important take-homes from this are that treated sites have significantly higher herbage production than untreated sites. However, the data was such that we could not detail how long ago these sites were treated or to what degree they were treated. The second general take-home is that increased juniper canopy cover is very bad for herbage production.
Can I just, is it okay for me to burst in like this, or do you want to just stop moving?
Yeah.
I'm sort of surprised that you get as much production as, it's almost 80%, and you still,
Yeah,
it's a
so
drop.
this y-axis is natural log, so if we, the
Oh,
relative
that's
range.
a log, sorry.
Yeah, the relative range of
Never
most of
mind,
these
never mind.
observations is about, 50 kilograms per acre to about 800.
Okay, rub it in, fine. I didn't see the natural log.
Yeah, so what this relationship allowed us to do is, given juniper canopy cover and the other variables that are sort of implicit in this, we could extrapolate across the landscape and predict for any given levels of our right-hand variables what the current herbage production is. And given changes in juniper cover that would result from treatment, we could predict the corresponding increase in herbage production. Right, so now I've just covered the herbage production benefits and move on to the sage-grouse benefits. So a lot of this was touched on by Cece earlier. She did a really good job, but some of it's worth repeating. So sage-grouse use sort of a wide variety of habitat throughout the year, but for tractability, we decided to focus on potential improvements to their breeding grounds, which, as you know by now, are called leks. So this is a lek. It's just, in simple terms, a wide arena, a flat, open arena in which birds congregate to perform strutting and courtship displays, such as this. Now, these leks are typified by sort of areas of very flat sort of topography and very sparse, low vegetative characteristics. So data on sage-grouse habitat suitability were sort of sparse and hard to come by, but admittedly, this is a growing area of research. In fact, Pete Coates has got some really cutting-edge stuff that he's developing in terms of sage-grouse habitat suitability. But for our purposes, we just developed a couple rules of thumb for determining sage-grouse was that we had a cutoff of 1% slope above which sites were not considered to be conducive to lecking habitat. Another assumption or rule of thumb was that treatment of these areas that met this cutoff would be such that it was conducive to this sort of sparse shrub coverage that would be appropriate for lecking. Now, in terms of total number of lecks in our study region, we saw a wide number of estimates from a low end of about 10 to a high end of about 70. We used a ballpark estimate of about 30 existing lecks in our study region, although we did vary this number as one of the sensitivity analyses, and Eric will detail this later. Now again, I think it's worth repeating that an important future extension of this model, particularly the sage grouse benefits portion of the model, is to incorporate real data and maybe even bird telemetry data. So I mentioned the 30 lecks on the landscape. So these green patches in our yellow landscape are the sites, the 30 sites that best meet our 1% slope cutoff threshold. So as Susie mentioned, connectivity is important in these breeding grounds. She used I think a radius of 4 miles. We used a more conservative number of 2.5 miles around which to capture the immediate area around the lecking habitat. So what we did is we buffered out from the center of these little patches out 2.5 miles to capture all the potential lecking habitat in the immediate area. And then the way the sage grouse habitat benefits are conferred is if a site or a cell in this green patch is treated, then you're conferred sage grouse habitat benefits. If it's a site outside the green habitat and it's treated, you don't get it. If it's inside the green patch and it's not treated, then you don't get it, right? So if it's in the green and it's treated, then you get sage grouse habitat benefits. So now I'll pass it on to Derek to touch on
Can I
that.
ask a question before you? Why did you focus just on lecking habitat? I mean, if the birds aren't getting any resources, I mean, it's just a place to find mates. I mean, wouldn't it make a lot of sense to also consider habitat for, foraging and everything else in their lives?
Right, so that was sort of the idea behind buffering around in this 2.5 mile area around the lek center. For tractability, we couldn't do a sort of all-encompassing habitat sort of treatment of sage grouse.
But it could be something like, plant cover or some other correlative appropriate habitat. I mean, so what you're doing is basically looking for the 1% slope, and, I can imagine, especially if it's a place that is really quite bare, that's probably not a very good place to look for forage, and in fact, in the limit, if it's the entire area is great lek habitat, then there's probably not much to eat. In other words, there may be some trade-offs. You may want to consider something about plant cover, some other metric that you can get your hands on that better describes the rest of the habitat.
Yeah.
So they, that tethered, I mean, they can't, I agree, I mean, I thought that maybe the reason to do that, right, is that where they're lacking, then they can only move out whatever, how many miles it was, conservative or not, and that's where you expect to find the grouse, or could they have a lek and then just cruise on, I mean,
For nesting, maybe
how much,
can't
how much,
fly.
how much tethering is there, I mean, to those points?
So there's studies on the distribution of birding activity around these lek centers.
Okay.
And there's something like 90% of the activity is captured within about 2.5 miles of these centers. So that's the reason behind this buffering.
So what portion of the year are they actually lecking?
Lecking is just on a very small portion. It's on the small arena of this.
No, how much of the year are they actually in the lek choosing mates?
A couple weeks a week.
So right, so the entire rest of the year, they're someplace else. That's what I'm saying, is that they may want to consider.
But my understanding is that 90% of them are within 2.5 miles of this.
Right, but you want to know what that plant description is within that 2.5 miles. So rather than just simply slope it, if you had something like plant cover or some other descriptor.
Yeah, we have limited vegetation data, not precise data on plant type and stuff like that. We can talk about that.
That is an extension we're hoping to do actually in collaboration with P-Codes using this new habitat suitability index model, which does incorporate vegetation type and a bunch of other variables.
Okay.
I know we just
So
obvious.
the 2.5%, I'll just address this real quick. We conducted utilization distribution analysis where different seasonal, what the seasonal utilization distributions were, and how much we're capturing at different buffer areas from LECs in 30-meter increments away from the LEC. And it turns out, as I said here, 90% of the utilization distribution on average year-round is captured. It's actually within around 3.2, so you're getting your 5-kilometer range. But that's migratory, non-migratory populations. A lot of these tend to be a little bit more on the non-migratory side, so it's a little more tighter. You capture all year-round use within approximately that 2.5.
These are all excellent questions, and I think many of them will be addressed later in the talk. So maybe hold them till the end. Thank you.
Good luck with that, Shayla.
Does Kevin get an exception?
So in addition to assessing the benefits in terms of herbage production and sage-grouse habitat that would result from removing juniper from a given site, we also needed to figure out how much treatment of any given site would cost. And so to do that, we conducted some site visits in the Modoc Plateau, as well as a bunch of semi-structured interviews with juniper management experts, representing a range of organizations from federal government to state government to private groups. Here are some photos from our site visits. One of the first things that became clear to us was that the primary factor influencing treatment cost is the choice of treatment method. So in areas with dense juniper cover, it's usually the most effective to come in with heavy machinery like this Timco and remove the trees that way. So we refer to this as mechanical treatment. In areas where the cover is sparser, it's usually more effective to come in with chainsaws and fell the junipers by hand. And we call that hand treatment. And then in some cases, it's feasible to chip the felled junipers and sell the biomass to power plants to help offset the cost of treatment. During our semi-structured interviews, we asked a range of questions having to do with the site factors that affect treatment decision, as well as factors that affect cost and how much each treatment method costs, in addition to a bunch of other questions. Not every expert felt qualified to answer every question, so we ended up with a range from 1 to 7 responses to each question. We were able to boil down our results from these interviews and site visits into a very simplified decision tree for determining the appropriate treatment type for a given site. So first we look at slope. Sites that have over 30% slope we consider not treatable due to concerns about erosion and accessibility, that sort of thing. Sites that are less than 30% slope, we further break down based on canopy cover. Sites that have less than 10% cover, we say are most suitable for hand treatment, whereas those that are over 10% are more suitable for mechanical treatment. And then sites over 30% cover, we ruled out from treatment due to concerns that perhaps the dense juniper cover may have suppressed the vegetation to a point where it won't recover following treatment without a lot of expensive restoration methods. But we can discuss whether this is a reasonable assumption. And then, so we assigned hand treatment a cost of $100 per acre based on interviews, and mechanical treatment $300 per acre. This is, of course, a very gross generalization of the sorts of factors managers consider, but we wanted a simple set of rules of thumb that we could incorporate into a model and make it more transparent and tractable. So once we had set these rules for evaluating the benefits and costs of removing junipers, we had to apply this to a real-world landscape. So we focused on these 4 red patches, and we broke them down into grid cells that are 2 kilometers on a side, or that's about a little over a mile on a side. And these are the units for which we assessed management decisions. These, like if you're deciding to treat or not treat these units. But of course, we realized that there's a huge amount of spatial variation within these cells that affect treatment decisions, and so we further broke these down into 400 cells of a hectare each, That's about 2.5 acres. And it's on this scale that we assessed the site attributes like slope and canopy cover. So in this example, we're assessing costs and we're assigning treatment type based on slope and canopy cover. So areas that are under 10% canopy cover are given blue for hand treatment, and over 30 or over 10 and under 30 assigned mechanical treatment, each with their respective costs. So then we summed the cost of treating each of these 1 hectare cells at the 2 kilometer scale and came up with a heat map of treatment cost for each of these 2 kilometer cells that are the decision management units in our model. So, so we did this similar analysis for cost here and also for the herbage production and sage-grouse habitat benefits, and came up with these 3 layers which were inputs to our decision model. So I'll pass it off to Eric to describe this model.
Little arrow at bugging me. Now we've seen how we assessed benefits for herbage production and sage-grouse on the landscape, and we've seen how we estimated the costs for treatment. So now let's take a look at how we put it all together in sort of the formulation of the model. Again, kind of revisit and expand that slide that Gabe had a little bit earlier. The objective, identify the optimal set of sites to treat for juniper removal, where you maximize herbage production benefits and meet targets for sage-grouse habitat reservation. So there's your multi-objective framework starting here. And then given a budget constraint. So there's a set budget, and what you're trying to do is figure out, of all these potential sites you have, which ones do you want to select? Now, there's actually a lot of literature on this going back about 10, 15 years, and we took a look at some of the different models that are available, and these site selection models provide the opportunity to do this through a number of open source or just applying typical modeling frameworks. There's a couple of software packages out there, Zonation and Marxan. These came out of academia looking at marine reserves and looking at landscape conservation decisions that need to be made by resource managers. And what they're trying to do is figure out what sites do you want to buy or try to conserve if you're going to help a particular species or several species. And there's a number of extensions that go on to this as to one species or several species, or also the connectivity question as to, do you need kind of a small area for this particular species, or does it require corridors for migration or something like that? When we kind of looked across at all the different models and the ways that the natural resource kind of academic research had looked at this problem, we realized that for this particular problem, given the ecology of sage-grouse with the lekking behavior and given the forage production, sort of the cost effects of that, we could do something maybe a little bit more straightforward. And that was actually just calculating the cost effectiveness of treating different cells based on the treatment benefits that you get from removing juniper for both herbage production and sage-grouse, and then divide that by the cost of treating that particular grid cell. Now once you do that, you can take and rank them. And this is sort of loosely based on kind of what they would call a greedy algorithm procedure, where you have a decision to make, you see the whole potential set of choices, and you pick the best one. So I'm going to pick the most cost-effective cell to treat based on my goals for herbage production or sage-grouse or both. And then once you re-examine everything, you look again, and you pick the next one that's best, and you pick the next one that's best. Now the one issue here is that you don't have the ability to go back and say, oh wait, that was a problem, I want to go back and change that. So you could maybe not find the best solution ever, but you're going to find a good solution for sure. And so once we found the cost effectiveness for treating a particular cell, we ranked that, and you just take all the cells up and you buy them and you conserve them until you reach your budget cap, whatever that cap is. And then after that, you calculate your benefits for sage-grouse habitat, and you calculate your herbage production benefits for the cells that you treat to remove juniper. So the way that we kind of worked this out and implemented it, we implemented a model in R, and we wanted to calculate the total benefits, which would include benefits for sage-grouse and benefits for herbage production. And you, as a natural resource manager, you're going to have different goals potentially. So you could try to manage removal of juniper just to maximize your forage production, or you could try to do it just to maximize your sage-grouse habitat. Or potentially, through this framework, you could look at, are you going to get both through managing for one or both goals? Okay? So we went through and we weighted here from 0 to 1 each of these the weighting of each of these benefits. And this is a weighting on your objectives, but not necessarily the results. Okay? So you weight here herbage production benefits. If you had the framework where they would be completely a one-to-one trade-off, you'd see here that you weight your herbage production benefits 100% and you get no sage-grouse benefits. And subsequently, as you sort of fill out this curve with these weightings, if it's a one-to-one trade-off regime, you see here that for a unit increase of benefits in sage-grouse, you get a unit decrease of benefits for herbage production. So this is the one-to-one trade-off scheme, which doesn't look very good if you're trying to manage for both goals necessarily. You have some tough choices to make. But you could also think about other schemes where maybe there is some level of complementarity and maybe it changes based on where you are. So you could see here if you increase your sage-grouse benefits by 1 unit, there's less than a unit of decrease degradation in herbage production here in this part of the curve. So if you're managing more in the forage production area and the herbage production area, then getting 1 unit of increase gets you less. Or down here, you might see that there's a greater reduction, more than 1 unit reduction. Or you could look at the possibility that they're very complementary and that increasing 1 unit of sage-grouse benefits doesn't really decrease your herbage production. So this is the way we went about analyzing the way the model was going to come out. And so we were looking for what the shape of these sort of frontiers were going to be. And let's take a look. So you see here, just like the last graph, sage-grouse habitat restored in square kilometers and additional herbage production in millions of kilograms. We do see not a straight line, but there is a trade-off curve. So it's indicating that there's complementarity, but there is a trade-off. Now, what else do we see here? If you are managing, if you have the goal and you're managing for herbage production, you're going to select sites that give you lots of herbage production, the cost effectiveness of that, but you don't get any associated sage-grouse benefits. As you move down the curve and you increase your requirements for getting sage-grouse habitat benefits, you see here your herbage production drops, but importantly, it doesn't go to 0, right? So you can manage the land for some amount of sage-grouse benefits and get associated forage production. Now this is the numbers, all right? There's another sort of story going on here, and that's the actual spatial configuration. And here is kind of interesting as well, because the complementarity that you see here, especially in this lower end, comes into a little bit of question based on the way we assess sage-grouse benefits in herbage production. So as you step through this curve, you see here there's good sites for cost-effective treatment for herbage production in these regions, but as you step through, you see that the places you would treat are different. Now that doesn't mean you're not getting herbage production, it just means the most cost-effective sites for herbage production are in a different part of it. You still get associated benefits, but that's why this curve looks like that. So this was our baseline case we had for a $5 million budget and about 30 sage-grouse habitat, or lek sites. These numbers are based on for the budget, around about estimate of the California Sage-Grouse Initiative budget for the state of California. Ranges from like 2 to 6 million for FY 10, 11, and FY 11, 12, according to their publications. And then also, as Gabe mentioned, with the 30 sage-grouse So we built on the baseline. Oh, first I'll talk about just especially why is this the case? Because we see, as Derek mentioned, there is differences in the spatial orientation of where you would treat for these places. Now let's move on from the baseline case a little bit and look at some of these extensions. Here first, if we try to identify the effect of budget, either budget increases or budget decreases, it's sort of a story here where if you have more budget, you can treat more for either sage-grouse benefits or herbage production. So you see more money equals more benefits. Just depends on, then you still have to figure out what's your goal. What's the mix of goals that you're looking for? Subsequently, we also do that and look at the number of lek sites that we would be sort of managing for. We picked a range here from 15 to 100. So let's say that you either are managing for 100 sites that you find suitable for sage-grouse habitat, or potentially you know where different numbers of lek sites are, right? Up here, if you manage to maximize your herbage production, there's no real difference. All these curves kind of converge here. But as you move down, you'll definitely see that with a little bit more knowledge, you can gain more of those sites. And for a given amount of herbage production, if you have more knowledge about where the sage-grouse, where habitat is or where they would be, then for a given amount of herbage production, you can get more sage-grouse. So these were the baseline case, looking at a couple of initial extensions, and now I'm going to turn it over to Matt, who's going to give you a little bit more about some of the extensions and sensitivity analyses we used in our model.
All right, thank you. So as Eric mentioned, we developed a number of extensions to our baseline model, and these are the ones that I'm going to describe here. So we consider these extensions as alternative scenarios in which we either relax an important assumption that's present in our baseline model, or we add additional factors. And so each of these scenarios is designed to reflect some sort of new set of assumptions about a key ecological, economic, or even administrative set of circumstances. So we first consider a situation in which land managers do not have perfect information about the potential suitability of a site they're considering for treatment in terms of its sage-grouse benefits. In our second scenario, we adjust the baseline model to see what might happen in the absence of coordinated activity between the major landowners or land managers in our study region. In our third alternative scenario, we introduce a market for biomass to see how that changes the benefit structure on our landscape. And in the fourth alternative scenario, we introduce fire as an additional method that managers can consider when they're considering treating a site. Okay, so here we consider the effect of imperfect information. So managers must make decisions about how to select sites under conditions of uncertainty. So in this extension of our model, the number of lek sites does not change, but managers are now unable to distinguish between sites that, if treated, would yield sage-grouse benefits, such as this one, and sites that are similar, but if treated, would not, such as this one. And here's what we find. So the green and the blue shaded ribbons reflect situations, or reflect the 95% confidence interval for a range of outcomes in which managers either have a 50%, in the case of the green ribbon, or 25% chance of essentially guessing correctly on this landscape. In a comparison to the black line there, which represents our baseline in which managers have 100% certainty that they're making the right decision to conserve habitat for sage-grouse, we see that the uncertainty leads to a substantial decrease in benefits to sage-grouse.
Could you say what the three different lines are?
Sorry, so this, they're kind of overlapping, so it's hard to see. There's actually two, and then they're just transparent, so it looks like there's a third one in the middle. But the one that's green, that's a little bit higher up, corresponds to a case in which there's 30 leks on this landscape that are real, or that if Juniper were removed, would be transformed into leks. But managers are aware of 60 potential sites, whereas the purple ribbon down there corresponds to that same situation, except they're choosing among 120 sites. Okay, so that's our first scenario. In our second scenario, it addresses the role of coordination. So in our baseline model, we assume that all land management groups operating in this study region are coordinating perfectly, sharing financial resources and carrying out projects that span jurisdictional boundaries. So we know that this is not always the case, but we were curious to see how the model would change if we relaxed this assumption completely. And so this is essentially a scenario we wanted to see, in the absence of the types of programs that Cece and Cassie described this morning, where you have these sort of mechanisms that foster kind of interagency or public-private sort of partnerships, we wanted to see how that might affect the kind of outcomes at the landscape level. And so there's no cooperation between these three groups that you see here, and the shaded regions for each of them corresponds to the amount of land that they are managing. So in this scenario, the budget for Juniper removal site or projects is divided among these groups in proportion to the amount of land that they manage. And then treatment decisions are made independently. So for example, the Bureau of Land Management would receive 51% of the budget because they manage 51% of the land. Then the model is run separately for each one, and the benefits are summed up over the entire landscape. And here's what we find. When one management objective is strongly emphasized, benefits from that objective are substantially lower compared to the baseline. So this is essentially because optimizing for optimal sites for managing either of the two objectives are not distributed evenly among the three management groups. So for example, most of the sage-grouse habitat in our model is located on Forest Service land. So when that objective is strongly emphasized in the model, the BLM and private groups are left with few options or extremely cost-ineffective options. Now interestingly, when the budget is allocated more evenly between the two objectives in this middle region, we see that uncoordinated action is surprisingly not that much worse than perfectly coordinated action. And our interpretation is simply that in these types of kind of budget allocated arrangements, there are enough sites in each land management group's jurisdiction that satisfy kind of the requirements of the objectives, that the kind of loss of options is not that consequential. So in our third scenario, we introduce a market for biomass, which was absent in the baseline model. So the Honey Lake Power Plant, you can see it down there, it's the red dot, is located about 30 miles south of our study area. And from speaking with a manager at the plant, we learned that revenue from the sale of juniper chips from any given treatment site is partly a function of the distance to this particular plant. So under current market prices, juniper chips sell for about $48 per ton. With increasing distance from the Honey Lake Power Plant, transportation costs rise until out here, at about 120 miles away, these costs exceed the potential sale price per ton of juniper. And so when we account for, and then actually more critically, at 60 miles away, the opportunity cost of potentially treating or getting fuel from some other location that's more accessible actually increases above the potential sale price of juniper. If that makes sense. So here's what we see on our landscape. There again is the Honey Lake Power Plant. And using the road network and the distances along roads, we find that down here, for example, that's within 30 miles out to 60 miles here, after which we get no potential revenue from biomass. And so then we combine estimates from the potential revenue from biomass with the actual amount of biomass on each site. So we use canopy cover to estimate the tons of biomass per site. And here's what we find, that there's 321 sites within our model, the way we've configured it, where you would, if treated, see some sort of cost reduction from the total cost of treating that site. And this ranges from a low of barely $400 per, again, these are two kilometers by 2 kilometer cell size, to over $150,000. And within these 321 sites, the average is nearly $36,000. However, despite these cost reductions, we don't see much improvement in our benefits curve. So this is actually two lines where the blue line is the contribution of biomass to the model. And so we see marginally higher benefits at certain points along this line, but in general, the potential subsidy from biomass doesn't add that much. And this is simply likely because when we compare the potential cost reduction from biomass to the total cost of treating each site, this is what we find. Here's our nearly $36,000 within each of these, across these 321 sites, compared to nearly $140,000, which is our average across all of the sites. So it's kind of hard to compare between, over 2,000 sites, which we consider in our full study area, and only 321. But if you were concentrating on biomass, these are the types of numbers that you would be looking at. Okay, so in our final scenario, we consider the use of fire as a potential method for removing juniper. So on one hand, fire is less costly than the other two methods that we consider. However, it's also much more risky. And so for this reason, it only becomes an option when land managers have the resources to comply with extensive regulations. So one of our interviewees noted that fire is really an ideal tool, except it's not used because it's such a liability. So in this final scenario, we assume that managers have either established some sort of burning cooperatives or associations or some other means to overcome the kind of bureaucratic obstacle that they face when hoping to use fire as a management tool. So that's in our final scenario. And we see that the benefits increase substantially because fire is less costly, a much larger area can be treated, which yields significantly greater benefits for both sage grouse and for production, or herbage production. So now, to put these results into context, I'll turn it over to Allison.
Okay, thanks, Matt. So, I am first going to talk about some opportunities for model improvement and things to keep in mind when interpreting our results. So, models, as we all know, are inherently simplifications of the world, but here are some particularly important assumptions that we made that keep in mind when thinking about our conclusion. So the first is that we only use a subset of the land that Juniper has encroached on in the Modoc Plateau region, and that was, as mentioned earlier, was due to limitations in wavelet data on Juniper canopy cover. So if we considered the complete landscape in the Modoc Plateau, or perhaps even a larger landscape, including more of the Great Basin where Juniper encroachment is a problem, that might change some of the patterns or trade-offs that we saw. Second, we had a pretty crude estimate of sage-grouse habitat characterization where we were focusing on their reproductive areas and then the buffer to include the nesting and brooding area when the birds can't fly. But now there's some new habitat suitability index available for the USGS, and so we're hoping to incorporate that and make that more accurate. Third, we assumed that if you treated by fire, hand, or mechanical, you got the same response on the ground. And in reality, the way you treat probably affects the response of the land. So we attempted to make the costs a little bit realistic of including potential restoration costs for some of the more destructive treatment types, but allowing the treatment type to affect the response that we see in terms of benefits might change some of the patterns we see. Finally, this we assumed was a one-time decision, and once you remove juniper, it does not come back on your landscape. But in reality, probably it does. It's a pretty slow problem, as we can see those pictures were hundreds of years apart, but including some sort of maintenance might be important. Also, it might take a little while for the benefits to appear, particularly in terms of sage grouse. And that's one reason actually that we chose to work in terms of potential sage grouse habitat benefits rather than changes to the population, because it's really hard to predict how birds will actually recolonize that land and how that will affect their population dynamics. Okay, so what are some of our take-home points? Give them those caveats. One is that we do see some level of complementarity between herbage production and sage grouse habitat. So this wasn't the straight line that Eric showed in his model setup, that you get some of both benefits even if you're taking the other. However, it's not a complete
or what your management targets are, what benefits you're going after. Okay, so another take-home point is that this is a somewhat budget limited problem. Currently, we can never hit any sort of plateau where you stop getting benefits of one type when you increase the budget. So if you have more money, more of both types of benefits are available. Also, it's good to note that if you set a particular sage grouse habitat target, you might not necessarily be able to reach that at all budgets. So it's important to know what that is when choosing your budget. Another way of thinking about this is that it's somewhat cost limited. If you introduce a cheaper treatment option like fire, if that was to become feasible without all the liability issues, potentially through cooperatives or something, it's really similar to increasing the budget. You just get more of both types of benefits available for your budget. Okay, and finally, we were somewhat surprised to see that biomass didn't play a particularly big role in changing in this region, but that's really dependent on the landscape that we chose and the location of the biomass plant. So this is one in particular that might change if we incorporated more of the Modoc Plateau in our region, or if we considered alternative locations of a biomass plant. And here at UC Davis, there's been a lot of research on biomass for primary site selection, so that's maybe something we could talk about this afternoon with the panel discussion. And so, for some of our conclusions, we set out to evaluate how different management priorities might change treatment. And in the process of doing that, we developed a methodology that can evaluate treatment locations based on different management goals. Then we created a baseline based on our best sense of the current situation and factors at play. But we recognize that that was an assumption and not perfect information, so we also investigated different scenarios. And one thing that stayed true throughout was that there is a complement. If you're focusing on sage grouse, you get herbage benefits, but there is somewhat of a trade-off between them. And that was true across scenarios and across our sensitivity tests. We also looked at the relative importance of other factors, including fire, coordination, and biomass, which were in those extensions you saw through MAP. And in our region and the way we formulated the model, fire and coordination seem to be particularly important and show a big impact. And finally, the way the model is set up, it can be extended to consider new data as it becomes available or other scenarios. I think those are important to consider. So we would like to thank all of the experts and stakeholders and managers that spoke with us about Juniper encroachment and management on the Modoc Plateau and more broadly. And we'd also like to thank all of the UC Davis and IGERT people who have supported us and provided us so much guidance. So thanks so much, and we'll take any questions. Right, feel free to chip in, everyone else.
So, were you evaluating each square independently, and is there any cost effectiveness to having aggregated control efforts as opposed to?
We were considering each square independently, and that was partially because of the size we chose for the grid cells. So they were large enough that they're about the size of allotments up there. We did at one point toy with the idea of choosing coordination and connectivity for our sage grouse benefits, but that did not make it into the final version.
There's no returns to scale in the costs. So.
But it also, it sort of simulates the way management takes place in terms of the sizes in which you would look to treat different sites. And the managers really do say, we've got a site over here, and a site over here, and a site over here, or these two sites.
I guess the other question is whether or not there's any indication that there would be non-additive benefits, like for sage grouse, by having contiguous controlled areas. And that, I guess that's another.
Marissa?
So, you've shown us the future next steps, but some management has already been done. Have you looked at where those lie on the cost benefit curve? Are they at the frontier? Are they following below the frontier? And where are they at in terms of the trade-off between results?
In terms of the stage of the invasion, or
Well, the restoration efforts that have been done to date, have they, given that they are these efforts to coordinate across multiple agencies, have they been able to achieve that frontier? Have you guys been able, or is that feasible with the model you have to look at that?
So I think that was part one of our study for anybody who remembers back, and we worked a lot with folks up there, and they are collating a database of treatment sites the resultant amount of juniper removal and the cost of that, and then subsequently looking towards the benefits. I mean, we have a time issue that's going on there, but that data is being organized right now as part of the overall stage step EIS that was referred to earlier, but we found that it didn't seem like that was going to be feasible in the time frame of our project, and that kind of statistical analysis I think is important.
But we could see, since our model does provide landscapes of actual, cells that are actual cells, we could compare, once that database becomes available, how the treatments that have been done line up with our predicted landscapes.
So I'll try to ask a focused question. So when you're calculating the cost, greater than 30%, you don't do anything like that. So how does that enter into your calculation of cost? Because there are big chunks where you don't do anything. And so low cost means that you don't touch it. And so how does that enter into the decision making?
So that's manifested in the checkerboard pattern. Yeah.
Right,
So if
so-
there's those fine resolution checkerboards
Right.
that exceed 30% cover,
Right.
those are left untreated.
And so,
So
okay.
zero
So,
benefits
so
get met.
zero benefit and zero
Zero,
cost.
okay, so there's 0 and 0.
Yeah.
Okay, so then that just shows a wash. It's almost like missing data or something. Does that matter?
Well, it
In the
matters
final
if you
analysis,
think
okay.
that you should consider treating areas over 30% canopy cover. We were kind of, based on the interviews, we kind of came to the conclusion that most managers don't consider treating areas over that cover density because a number of factors, often that can indicate old growth juniper, which is during these denser stands. That's the way we kind of incorporated that aspect. Also, the canopy can be so dense that it will suppress the understory plants to the point where they won't come back once you clear the trees. So, but although we did have some discussion earlier today as to whether that's actually true. So,
We could add in a,
It's
higher
cool you
cost
can
thing.
put it that way,
yeah.
By the way, it's very cool.
I wasn't sure, but in the sort of institutional constraints scenario, there was like 11% that wasn't accounted for in either of those three groups.
I think that's just Fisher Lawn District, there's a refuge there or something.
Oh, so, yeah, there are actual areas within our treatment kind of domain that we don't consider. So we don't consider the boundary cells because there's problems
Right.
with, but then also there's a lake, and so we don't consider that. I might have just used the wrong numbers in the slide if you were adding them up and they didn't sum.
I was adding them up, but there was also this like circular area that.
Okay,
Is that the lake?
that is in fact. So kind of similarly with what Gabe and Derek were explaining about how we just, if a cell violated certain kind of criteria in our decision tree, it has no benefits and no cost. We did the same thing for these kind of large regions that had a lake in them.
Okay.
I maybe had just as a practitioner, and I recognize the modeling is general, but when you did the biomass, you were doing blocks of area. For us, when we determine costs, it's the roads to the area that control everything. So unless I have biomass within a quarter mile of an existing road that a chip truck can use, I can't get the biomass. So perhaps that's something to consider because we use roads and that spaghetti network to determine availability rather than blocks. That's just a thought. Again, just based on what we do. The second part of biomass, existing plants, we will not ever put in another new plant in northeastern California because of infrastructure and because of cost and because we can't get the proper power purchase agreement. So that may be an interesting exercise,
Right.
but unless there's something existing like in Big Valley where we have a site, it would be very, very difficult to get one of any size. Honey Lake is now and would be an aberration. It's wonderful to have that. The second part was very quickly the fire. We can't run fire through phase 3. In other words, we cannot use it because we can't get the trees to, for any kind of, we can't consume it. We have no ground cover. We have to stack tires and brush against the trees to make it burn. So phase 1, phase 2, we can run fire and get some results. And phase 2 is kind of chancy. But use of fire in phase 3 is very, very difficult unless you got a blowtorch at the wind. So that's, I'm
I
not
think
sure.
that might actually be consistent. I glossed over the way in which we decided where to use fire. And to be honest, right now, I just forget what we did. But it was, we used some sort of a threshold where we wouldn't burn above, I think it was also 30.
I think it was actually 20%.
Okay.
So the fire, in the fire scenario, it replaces all of the hand treatment and then some of the mechanical treatment.
That would make more sense. Once you get to 60, 70% canopy cover, there's no ground vegetation left. Compare it elsewhere.
This stuff won't burn. I mean, you know, that's one of the issues, like liability issues, like, okay, if we don't burn it now, it's gonna burn eventually, and then it's gonna be catastrophic. But what you're saying is these things, as they get older, they just won't burn.
It's very difficult. If you have 40 mile.
I know there's no fine field, but I mean, if they don't, you know.
It's very difficult.
They'll burn under catastrophic situations.
Well,
They
that's
won't
what I'm
burn
just-
under prescriptive situations.
Okay, but so that's what I'm just wondering, when we talk about like, okay, the liability issues and that, we're finding that in California right now, like, okay, it's gonna happen eventually though. And just, so that's just, okay, so, but these things will burn on catastrophic. It seems like, yeah, man, these things could.
It has to be a high wind event, and then you just.
Yeah, but we never have wind up there, right?
Right. It never goes like. The very last thing was something to do with, and I didn't hear that variable mentioned, but we use aspect. We're going to determine where to treat, and where we're going to get our best treatment. We're going to go for our best developed soil areas if we have a choice. And of course, Tim has lots of money. And then that's just one of the simple things we've done between road access and aspect, where if you're a landowner, where do you treat? Well,